Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you all in our first and virtual SU Behavioral Design Fest. We are very pleased to have you on board with several hundred behavioral design enthusiasts among us today here in this session. A session which is the first of several that we'll be sharing with you this week, and with which we intend to inspire you, to enlighten you, to give you new and fresh ideas about the exciting world of behavioral design. We start today with a guest of which I'm very proud to be able to introduce him to you in a minute. I'll let him introduce himself to you. I'm talking about Matt Wallaert, but just as a small anecdote to picture you the importance he has for us and our company, I joined SU several months ago as its new managing director, and it's been one of the most fun and exciting jobs I've had so far in my long career until now. And when I applied, the people that hired me checked if I was up to speed about what's important in behavioral design. And they said, basically, you just should read one book. And I have it here with me. It's this one. It's Matt's book. And I've read it, with enthusiasm. And I can honestly say what I've read has definitely become part of the DNA of our company. And so in a way, he is, without even probably knowing, one of the key hidden founding fathers of our thought processes, which we share with our clients and which we try to apply in the way in which we make behavioral design work with our customers. So I'm very pleased that he, from out of San Diego, where it's 4 a.m. in the morning, is sharing his ideas with us. So Matt, without any further ado, very much looking forward to your talk. So the floor is yours, Matt.
Thanks so much. And it is in fact 3 in the morning. It's not even 4. And so when we started testing this webinar software, it was 2:30 in the morning. And so if I fall over in the middle of this talk, you'll all know why. We have a lively discussion going on. People are saying hello in the group chat. This will be very conversational today. Feel free to put questions as we go. We'll do questions at the end as well, but I'll try and work them into the talk and I've got the thing going on. Like, respect you as well, Emil. Like, this is not so bad, you know. I will happily get up at 2 in the morning and talk about behavioral science because I love it. It's fun. You know, I've been doing it for 20 years. So my name is Matt Wallaert. I'm a social psychologist by training. I left academia a long time ago and started applying behavioral science, first in startups, then generally in larger companies. And I am the brand new executive director of behavioral science at Frog, which is part of Capgemini. And I fundamentally believe, and I think that the beginning of behavioral science is always that everything we do to change behavior. So it isn't like behavioral science is a bunch of PhDs in a corner somewhere, you know, and it lives over there with them. We all can be behavioral scientists. We all can be applied behavioral scientists. Because to me, behavioral science is behavior as an outcome, science as a process. And so we have to, when we talk about behavioral science in organizations, the topic they asked me to talk about today, the first thing we have to do is to get everybody in an organization to see themselves as capable of being a behavioral scientist, to see their job as behavior, right? The point of a chair is to get you to sit, right? Or to get you to look at it, or to get you to buy it, or whatever the behavior that you care about is. But centralizing behavior in that process is what allows us to do behavioral science, because we literally can't do science until we know what outcome we want, right? When we do applied science, we are trying to create a particular set of behaviors. And so we have to articulate everything we do as a behavior. I often joke that, you know, I believe there could be a behavioral CFO. The CFO has a set of behaviors that they want to get out of people in the world. Sorry, I was distracted by a message in Dutch. The CFO has a set of behaviors they want to get from people in the world, whether it's adhering to the travel policy of the company or getting everybody to turn in their timesheets on time. At Frog, I started last week, and I was like, what are some of our worst, toughest behaviors? People were like, man, it's hard to get people to fill out their timesheets on time. And if you're running an agency, time is incredibly important. It's how you build. It's how you understand everything. And so, I sat down with the CFO and we talked about, okay, how would you actually go change the timesheet behavior? So the first thing I want to sort of get across today is there's literally nothing that anyone has ever been able to challenge me with where I haven't been able to link it back to behavior. That is the job of everyone. And so once we've done that, we can then talk about science as a process. So, they sort of held up the book, which proposes a sort of 8-week design sprint that we use to change behavior. But I will sort of break it up into four big categories from my perspective. And the reason that I'm breaking it up into these 4 categories is when you talk about behavioral science in an organization, I think there is the entire process that is behavioral science, but it may not be the same person guiding that entire process at every step. Ideally, it is, because there's huge virtue that you get when people are able to carry something all the way through a process. But I think sometimes, just because of practicality, different people are going to do different pieces. So we need to figure out how to break those pieces up. So as an example, the first of the 4 things that I think we have to do is what we're sometimes calling behavioral strategy. And that is, what is the behavior and the justification for that behavior that we really macro want to change, right? So you could sort of think of this as the strategy that McKinsey or BCG or anyone else is going to do for you. They're looking at the market. They're trying to understand lots of things. But ultimately, the key in behavioral science is putting that in behavioral terms, right? What is it you actually physically, literally want people to do? The deliverable that McKinsey comes back to you with is often, well, you should, go into the cell phone space. What does it mean to go into the cell phone space? What do you actually mean? You want people to buy a cell phone, rent a cell phone, use cell phone service? Do you care about whether they use it at all, or do they just have to buy it? What is the actual behavior that you care about, that you can monetize, that fits into your window of sort of economics? So that's sort of behavioral strategy, it's that articulation. In my process, I always formalize that as a behavioral statement. I'll put one in the chat, right? So when population wants to motivation and they limitations, they will behavior as measured by data. Let's do one together just because it's fun. Arbitrarily, let's use the example I use in the book, since that way you guys don't have to buy the book. Let's use Uber. What is Uber's behavioral statement? What is the population for Uber? Who is Uber for? This is not a rhetorical question. This is why we have the chat. I expect to see people who should be typing away. I know I can't see your video, but typey. What is the population for Uber? Who is Uber for? People. Uber is for everyone. Now, that's incredibly unusual, by the way. Most companies, when I ran Microsoft Ventures, I would get pitched by 1,000 startups a year, and they'd be like, our startup's for everyone. I'm like, no, it's not. It's for, young women who just graduated from college, right? Some really specific niche. It's not for everyone. Uber is, in fact, for everyone. I'm pretty sure if a chicken could figure out how to dial an Uber, they would drive it across the road. They'd be like, get in the back. They don't care. Anyone, right? And then they need a motivation, right? When anyone wants to what? And people have put that in there, right? They want to get from point A to point B. So, Emil, it's interesting. It isn't true that they don't have to have transport means of their own. Lots of people who take Ubers have cars, right? It's not necessarily just for commuters. It's for anyone who, Nick, I don't know that it's not for toddlers. I think if Uber could figure out a way, if a toddler had a cell phone, I think Uber would be like, sure, get in the back. As long as you can figure out how to order one of the ones with a car seat, they would do it, right? I think they're for everyone. They haven't figured out how to transit pets yet, but I'm sure that they will. And then there's that motivation. We want to go from point A to B. Now, the key thing about motivation is this is the binary thing that must be true for people to go into the behavioral set that you're talking about, right? There are lots of other things that make taking an Uber more likely. We'll talk about those later on. But when we're talking about sort of what must be true for you to want to go, you have to want to go somewhere. There's no other reason to take an Uber. If you don't want to go somewhere, then there's not a reason to go. So when people, right, I'll put this back. So I'm going to keep this kind of pinned to the top here, right? So when people want to go from point A to point B, and they what must be true, again, binarily, for people to have to be able to use an Uber, right? What must be true? We're talking about these limitations. Again, it's not something that makes a behavior more or less likely. It's what must be true. We're actually going to talk about that in a minute. Drinking and driving is actually a great example. Yep, Astrid, great comment. They have to have a debit or credit card. They have to have some electronic form of payment, right? Martijn, it's not that they don't have their own transit. Once again, I can have my own car and still take an Uber, but I have to have an electronic form of payment. If I don't have an electronic form of payment, right, I cannot take an Uber definitionally. I gave a talk in Ukraine, and I got in the back, and they drove me where I was supposed to go, and I got out, and the guy said, "Okay, now you pay me." And I'm like, "What? This is an Uber. Like, this all happens through the app." He's like, "No, cash." And it turns out, in order to take an Uber in some markets, you can pay cash because this was such a serious limitation, right? That you had to have cash. Well, in India, electronic form of payment. There's not enough electronic form of payment. It's not widespread enough in India, so you can pay in cash. Rosan, great one. They have to have the app, right? And thus, what's sort of implied by that? We have to have a smartphone, and you have to have connectivity, right? So they need a phone with connectivity with some form of electronic payment. They also need to be in some market where Ubers are available. I'm from very rural Oregon originally. There's not Uber drivers driving around in the middle of nowhere, right? Like, there are places where Uber just won't pick you up, right? So there are practical limitations on the service. You have to live in a particular area. And we could go on and on. There's lots of limitations. But it's important to understand what these are, because you're often at a behavioral strategy level, you may have to play with these in order to expand your market, right? Like Uber, you might have to say, hey, we got to figure out a way for people to pay with cash. Because in the US alone, when Uber came out, right, it debuted in San Francisco, something like 15% of adult Americans did not have an electronic form of payment. So their total addressable market, if you think of this from a strategy perspective, was reduced by 15% simply because they required electronic payment. Now, they were fine with that at launch, but over time, you might have to change those limitations in order to go places. So when someone wants to go from point A to point B and they have an electronic form of payment and all these other sorts of things, they will what? What is the behavior that Uber wants? Right? What is the physical, observable behavior that Uber wants? Jonathan, right? You're right. They have to have an account. Yeah. Order a ride. That's it. Else you're 100% right. They want you to order the ride. Because it's not as simple. This is where precision of language matters. It's not as simple as use the app, right? If I open up the app and I figure out how much it would cost for me to go from point A to point B, that is not a behavior that Uber wants to, that cares about at the end of the day. This is what I sometimes call the pen problem, right? So sometimes we'll get distracted and we'll hold the pen from the wrong angle. So we'll be like, well, what we want is for people to use the app. No, I don't. I want people to order a car, right? That's what I care about. If I can figure out how to get them to order a car without ever using the app, I would do it. You can only hold the pen from one side and then pivot around, right? Now, it might be that, hey, I care about people, registering to get an account so that they can, take a ride. But what I care about is really take a ride. And I have to, at my macro level, I have to be sure to say, hey, what I care about is people taking a ride. Because otherwise you'll restrict your thinking, right? You'll say, oh, no, I really want to get people to download the app. But why? If I could get people to use an Uber without downloading the app, without ever knowing that they were going to take an Uber, I'd do that. Absolutely, right? If I could get people to take rides with no app at all, I'd do it, right? I'm happy to pivot around anything down here as long as people take a bunch of rides. Does that make sense? Right? We really have to be very specific about here's the thing that we care about. And then we're going to measure that, right? Because that's that last piece, right? We'll put it back in there one last time. Ooh, that's wrong short code. All right, we have to measure that some way. As measured by data. How are we going to measure that behavior of taking a ride? We can come up with any number of metrics. It's rides per minute or rides per month or rides per second or whatever you want to do. But there's some concrete instantiation, right? For those of you familiar with OKRs, in some ways, the O is the behavior. It's the descriptive thing that we want, right? Should be physical, should be observable, right? And then the sort of KR is that data piece. It's like, okay, well, how are we going to measure that objective has actually occurred, right? So this is a behavioral statement, and this is what I sort of think of as the key deliverable for the sort of, behavioral strategy portion of behavioral science, because you can't really do the rest of the process if you can't articulate this. And what I will tell you is this is probably about half the battle. So as someone, who has a lot of experience doing this, we have all seen that the breakdown in communication at companies is often around a lack of alignment around what it is we actually are trying to get people to do, right? This is why, I've talked about being precise in our language, right? Because often we'll sort of get to what we think is agreement. We'll all be nodding along. We're sort of like, yeah, we want people to use Uber, right? So like Julia and Yoz and I were like, all right, we're all on the same team. And what we get is like, okay, we want people to take Uber or use Uber, right? But the problem is that like Steven walks away from that conversation me thinking, well, that means register for an app or download the app. And Angelo walks away from that conversation thinking, oh, that means get people rides, right? And Emil walks away from that conversation thinking, oh, right, that means, spend money, right? I care about the raw dollar spent or something, right? No, we have to be incredibly precise. What we care about is number of rides. That is our metric. I don't care if they go a block or 100 blocks. I don't care about how much money they spend. I don't care about if they download the app or created a thing. Like what I mean is, when use means is order a ride, hit the little button and book a ride. It's that precision of language, right? That's why we write this up front, because then we have something canonical we can go back to. And this is the thing that we'll always be returning throughout the process, right? Is this, okay, what is it we actually do? Now, inside of an organization who's doing this, it can be anyone, right? This is a conversation. Project managers are usually the ones who are owning this, but there's some sort of stakeholders, right? Executives or other people with whom this is an implicit contract. For those of you that are in a position of leadership, you can use this for management, right? So let's say, I'm just picking people out of the chat, right? Let's say I report to, who haven't I picked on? I report to Else, and Jonathan reports to me. So Else is the CMO of Uber, and she says, hey, the behavioral statement we've been given is get people to download the app. That's it. That's our job. Download app, right? And so she says, all right, Matt, I've got a number of lieutenants. Maybe she'll say, I want you to focus on a particular population. I want you to get men to download the app, or people in North America to download the app, right? Or maybe she'll focus on some sub-behavior. I want you to focus on find it in the App Store, right, as a precursor to download the app. I know that there's this master metric that is download the app. So there's a nested metric that is finding the app. Your job is get people to find the app, right? And so then I go to Jonathan, who works for me. I say, okay, Jonathan, your job is to get people in the Netherlands to find the app, right? I'll narrow it down. And what that is, that set of nested behavioral statements, right, is now a set that establishes autonomy and accountability, right? I can say to Jonathan, hey, your review is very simple. It will be good if you got people in the Netherlands, right, to download the app. It will be bad if you didn't, right? And here's how we're going to measure that. We've agreed up front, like all of the pieces of that are going to be yours. And you could go all the way down, right? Someone works for Jonathan and he's going to say, okay, your job is, people in Amsterdam finding the app, right? And someone works for that person and they're going to be like, your job is men in Amsterdam finding the app, right? And then it's, you can just keep subdividing. And what that accountability does is allow for autonomy. Because now I can say to Jonathan, all right, because I can hold you accountable, I can allow you to be autonomous, to make your own decisions about how you get there, to run the behavioral science process, right, to get there. So that's why we do these nested behavioral statements. And so you can imagine this sort of proliferation. At the top of the company is one statement. We are all trying to get people to take rides. That is how we will judge our success as a company, right? And then we'll break that out. CMO, your job is to get people to register and download the app, right? And product person, your job is to once they have the app, to get them to use it, right, to book rides. And so, hey, you now have non-overlapping autonomy and can be held accountable for that. All right, so that's behavioral strategy, and we'll come back to it later for questions. And feel free to throw them in if something's unclear. Once we've arrived at an articulation, once we agree on what it is we're trying to do. Why is there a second group? What if there's, for example, the Uber driver? Yeah, great question, Oscar. So this is actually the one of the hardest things about two-sided markets. So what Oscar based asks is, okay, but in order for people to take rides, we need drivers and things. Yes, that's true, but let's go back to our pen, right? What we care about is consumers booking rides. That's what we care about, is how we make our money, right? We might, at the moment, need drivers to be willing to drive people places, but that's subordinate to people taking rides. And how do I know? Because if I did this and only this, it would not be sufficient, right? Always, the test for things is sufficiency, right? If I got a bunch of drivers willing to drive people places, I still wouldn't be satisfied. Whereas if I got a bunch of people, willing to take rides, I'd be okay with that. Right? Because there's lots of ways to pivot around down here. Autonomous driving, right? Like, trained monkeys. Like, there's lots of ways for me to get to the sort of like driving people places. Don't quote me on that. Uber's not doing trained monkey drivers. That's a bad idea. I'm just trying to get a laugh. But there is, Oscar, ultimately always something that we actually care about. And that's why I said this is actually really hard. This is why, we could spend hours in these meetings. We have to come back to them. We need to think about them deeply, because ultimately we are trying to care about a thing. I'll give you a great example, actually. Microsoft bought, I was working at Microsoft as their behavioral scientist. We had just bought Yammer, maybe a year into the acquisition. And, things were not going well on the product front. So I flew down there and I got all the product managers in a room and I just started listening. I said, hey, just walk me through your process, help me understand what's going on. And what I quickly realized was they were not aligned around a behavioral statement. So half of them were designing for Jonathan. Jonathan logs into Yammer every single day. He, comments on every post. He's the most engaged user you've ever seen, but he creates no business value of any kind, right? The other half were designing for Oscar. Oscar never logs in. He never comments. In his entire career at Microsoft, he's logged in one time, commented on one thing. But that one comment drove tons and tons and tons of business value. And half the people were trying to get Jonathan, right? The behavior they cared about was engagement. And half the people were trying to get Oscar. What they cared about was business value, right? Comments that drove business value. And the problem is that causes you to build two very different projects. Right? A product that gets people to be on it and engaged all the time, and it's about engagement and sort of community, is very different than a product that is about like extracting business value and business valued comments from people. Now, it may be that one leads to the other. Remember our pen, right? It may be what you're saying is, well, I care about business value and I believe that engagement leads to business value. That's fine. But what that says is, if someone came along and proved to me conclusively that engagement did not lead to business value, I would abandon engagement. Right? I would move on to some other tactic, or vice versa. I could say, hey, what I care about is engagement, and I think creating business value gets people to want to be engaged, right? But again, what that implies is, well, if someone showed me that business value did not predict engagement, I'd move. Does that make sense? So that's why they're, all groups, even in a two-sided market, we only care about one side of the market ultimately. Right. And then the others are subordinate to that. And that's cool. That's fine. We just create behavioral statements that are nested in order to get to that. So let's say we have a good behavioral statement. This is where we get into sci-fi mode. And this is the sort of the next piece where we get into what we might call behavioral insights or behavioral research, or there's different articulations of how we might talk about this. But basically, all of us are science fiction authors, right? That's what it is to be a behavioral scientist. And here's what I mean by that. When we articulate a behavioral statement, we are articulating a world that does not yet exist. When people want to go from point A to point B and they have an app and blah, 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 they will take an Uber. That world does not exist. Not everybody does that. Like this is an alternate universe that does not yet exist. Then there's a world of behavior that does exist, right? Where some amount of the population is doing this or they're doing something else, right? And our job when we're doing behavioral science is actually to build products that build a bridge between the world that is and the world that isn't, right? All of us are science fiction authors because we're trying to create worlds of behavior that do not yet exist, right? They don't actually belong. And so when we do behavioral insights or behavioral research, this sort of second piece, what we're trying to do is understand, okay, well, what bridge is it we need to build? And in order to do that, we need to understand two things. First, why the heck would anyone ever want to live in this world that doesn't exist? Why is this a desirable outcome? Why is this a desirable universe to anybody but us? We know it's desirable to us, Uber, because it makes us money, right? But why is it desirable to our target population, to people? Why would people want to live in this alternative universe? And if we can figure that out, then there's a second piece, which is, well, okay, given that people want to live here, why the hell aren't we already here? right? Like if this is a desirable universe, but we're not in that universe yet, why aren't we in that universe? Because it's desirable, right? Collectively, we think of these as sort of inhibiting pressures, right? Things that keep us from that universe, and promoting pressures, things that make us want to be in that universe, right? And that's what we're doing. We're building the bridge between those two worlds. And so we do a bunch of research to try and figure that out. And so that research is usually a combination of qualitative and quantitative. Those can be done by different people. So you can take your data scientists and your user researchers and set them up this way. I want cross-validation. I never believe something unless I can both physically observably see it, right? I can get it from the qualitative side, and I can measure it, right? I can get it from the quantitative side. And so typically what I'm having people do is having them go off separately. Hey, help me understand these two factors from a quant perspective. Help me understand these two factors from a qual perspective. And then coming back together and saying, okay, I just talked to Wicca, and Wicca tells me that they're from the quant department maybe. And they say, hey, we're finding that, the reason people want to be able to take Ubers, if we look at the data, is there's something going on with gender here, right? And then I can give that to Oscar, and I can say, okay, Oscar, who's a qualitative, user research person, I can say, hey, the data people are telling me there's something around gender. Can you go investigate that and help me understand what's going on, right? I want to understand that sort of cross-validation. So we can use all sorts of different kinds of research techniques. Generally, I'm looking at 5 groups of behavior, right? So I recently added a 5th group. So I know I originally started with 4, but I realized there's a 5th. So I'm trying to talk to 5 kinds of people. One are people who always do this thing, right? So if you think about Uber before Uber existed, there were people who were taking they always took rides with other people, right? Someone else drove them around. I need to understand their behavior. They're always doing the thing I want them to do, which is let someone else drive them around, right? Then there's a second group I care about, which is never. They never let other people drive around. They only drive themselves, right? They never take any other form of transit. They never let anyone else be in control. They only drive themselves. Why? What's going on? And remember, in each of these cells, I'm trying to understand 2 things. Why the hell would they want to live in a world where people are driving people around, and why aren't they already living there? So always, never, just started. Right? So I didn't used to let people drive me around, but all of a sudden I've done something. These people are really valuable to me because something has changed, right? Something has changed in my world where I went from a state of not doing to a state of doing. That's perfect because they actually went through the change that I want. They've somehow crossed the bridge from the universe that was to the universe that I want. And so understanding how they made their own bridge can clue me into how I might want to make a bridge, right? And vice versa. There's people who just stopped. I used to, let other people, Julia used to drive me around all the time. All of a sudden, I'm not driving around in Julia's car anymore. Why not? What changed? Maybe I got my own car. Maybe I don't have places to go. Like I can now start to understand that thing. And, if you go talk to 3, 5, 10, 20 people in that group, you will very quickly start to see an emerging pattern of pressures, an emerging pattern of reasons, insights into why people do this thing. And then the last group is people who have mixed behavior. Sometimes Julia drives me around. Sometimes I drive myself. Okay, well, what's going on, right? I'm on the bridge. I'm like halfway between the world that I want and the world that is. Like, what's going on? Why am I stuck on the bridge, right? Help me understand, what's going on for you. So let's just walk through a really quick practical example. Again, there are agencies that'll do this for you, right? Like Ipsos has a behavioral science unit, right? They'll do sort of market research version for you. And so that's why I think we can separate these out, right? You could, if there was a behavioral version of McKinsey, you could get them to help you generate a behavioral strategy, right? Then there are market research, sort of different kinds of research firms that could help you do this piece, right? If you need to externalize it. I think ideally, again, this is done in a way where it all sticks at the same place. That's what we're trying to do at Frog. We believe the virtue is that, by doing this all in one place, the connections are better and you actually get a more virtuous cycle. But I do think it can be broken up inside of a company, right? You could have a strategy team and you could have a quant and a qual team that are sort of doing this. Let's work through a practical example. So when I was at my most recent gig before Frog I was the Chief Behavioural Officer at Clover Health. And so one of the things we cared about was, oh no, I've frozen. Here, I'll type the always, never, sometimes, just started, just stopped. If you're stuck, refresh or pretend like fallen out of the space-time continuum. All right. So let's walk through a practical example. I was at Clover. The executive said to me, "Hey, Matt, we really, one of the things that we're rated on is people feeling that their doctor is easy to use, right? So there's a survey question: is care, test, and treatment easy to get?" Right? And we're literally paid and rated by the government on people's answer to this question. Is it easy to get the care and test and treatment that you need? So we have a population of people who say yes, population of people who say no. So we start to investigate. So we get a good behavioral statement. We're now into the sort of research phase. You start with some sort of logical hypotheticals that you can test. So one of the logical hypotheticals is, well, if you have to go a long way to your doctor, thank you, Menno. Like, I used to work for Microsoft, so that's from my Microsoft days. I did live in Seattle. A logical hypothesis would be, if you have to go a long way to a doctor, probably you don't think it's very easy, right? Now, that's a fairly quant testable hypothesis, right? Because I know where you are and I know where the doctor is. And so from a data science perspective, I can do some pretty trivial math using Google API to sort of understand, like, okay, well, how far apart are these two pieces? And so quant says, all right, yes, distance and ease are correlated, but in the inverse direction. So the farther that you live from your doctor, the easier you think it is to get care, test, and treatment. Well, that feels weird, right? We're all going, all right, what's going on here, right? And again, this is why we ping back and forth. You could go look through a bunch of quant data and probably not figure out why this is. But the qualitative person called, 5 people and figured this out immediately. So the qualitative user researcher, she went and called 5 people, and she said, "Matt, I know exactly why this is." And it turns out the reason is, if you can go a long way to your doctor, you are probably relatively affluent. You are healthy enough to be able to drive yourself, right? Or you have access to enough money that someone else can drive you, right? You're well off, right? You're not feeling that badly because you can transit long distances. And so no wonder you think care, test, or treatment is easy, because you probably are rich, probably white, and probably pretty healthy. And so, again, starts with a quant insight, which we then can give to a user researcher who calls some people and says, "Oh yeah, I understand why this is," right? Which then goes back and forth, right? So now we know, okay, it sounds like, race and health and socioeconomic status, how much money you have, may be important factors. So they can go back to quant and say, "Hey, does it turn out that these things are true?" And quant can say, "Oh yes, now that I know that I should be looking at those things, if I look at those in the data, it turns out, yes, these people who are pretty healthy feel like, care, test, and treatment is easy to get. The sicker you are and sort of the poorer you are, the harder that is." Okay, great. So that leads us to another potential hypothesis. Well, maybe rich people live in neighborhoods where they have access to good doctors, and poor people live in neighborhoods where there aren't good doctors. Maybe it's a problem of doctor supply. Once again, this is an insight that you can explore using data, right? Because you can map the quality of the doctors, you can map people's responses to doctors, you can see if it's correlated with socioeconomic status, right? You can actually get to those pieces. So we do this, and it turns out, no, even in poor neighborhoods, there are good doctors. Even in poor neighborhoods, there are good doctors. All right. Well, if some people in poor neighborhoods think they have a good doctor and some people in poor neighborhoods think they have a bad doctor, what's the difference between the two? Again, user research starts calling people. Quant says, here's a list of people who rated their doctor highly. Here's a list of people who, here's a list of people who live in poor neighborhoods. Some of them rated their doctor highly. Some of them rated their doctor low, right? So always and never, right? The two categories we care about. And they just start calling folks, right? And again, we can call people who, like, hey, you used to rate your doctor badly, and now you all of a sudden are rating your doctor well. What happened? Well, again, you call 5, 10, 20 people, and what it turns out is your problem is medical racism, right? If you have spent your entire life going to doctors that are no good, if you then move into a neighborhood and you randomly assort, you just take the first doctor that you find. If you randomly assort into a doctor that's bad, you don't change, because your experience tells you there are no good doctors, right? If all of your doctors up to this point have been shitty racist assholes, and you get a shitty racist asshole, you're like, oh yes, another shitty racist asshole. This is like what you get from doctors, right? You literally don't know that anything better exists. And so if you don't know that something better exists, you'll never then switch to a better doctor, right? So that's that insights phase. It's this ping-ponging back and forth between quant and qual, where they're cross-validating each other. They're saying, hey, I saw this. Can you also see it using your lens, right? And you can use other lenses too. You could use research. So, hey, like I saw this in our population. Can I find papers that support or sort of suggest that that's not actually true, right? That's a great, you've got to think of the truth as a table, right? We're just trying to build as many legs as we can that show that that table is level and stable so we can build an intervention on top of it. So that's that sort of research phase. You can buy it from somebody. Don't let this take 6 months. Right. This is a place where I think people, this whole process shouldn't be going on for more than about 10 weeks. You're talking a 2-3 week process. The thing I just described took 2 weeks, right? Because every day, quant and qual are talking, right? Quant has insights. They're giving them back to qual. Qual's calling people. They're coming, it's a very quick process, right? Because it's very focused, because they're collaborating in such a way that they can sort of support each other towards cross-validation. So it shouldn't take forever. So we start out with behavioral strategy, the articulation of the behavior that we want, right? Then we got to behavioral insights, right? We tried to understand, okay, well, why are things the way they should be? Why aren't we living in the world we already want? All those sorts of things. Now we actually have to do something with this. And this is where I think of as behavioral design. So given that we know what we want out the end, and given that we have some insight into why we're not there, we can start to imagine interventions that will move us there. And this is, I have you map out promoting and inhibiting pressures, like, all right, based on insights, what did I learn about why people do this and why people don't do this? And then I can start to align things against that. Okay, well, how do I actually choose that? Because in reality, when we change people's behavior, all we're really doing is changing their pressures that then change their behavior. I can't reach out, like I have a 5-year-old. If I want him to wear a particular pair of pants, when he was a newborn, I could like stuff him in the pants, right? Like, because he didn't have a choice. But at 5, like if he decides to kick his legs, I'm not getting those pants on. What I can do is change the environment, the pressures that make up his pant-wearing decision, right? I can control what's on his shelf because he's 5 and he doesn't have any money and he can't go to the store. So I can control what pants are on that shelf, right? So I can change the pressures in the environment. I can make it easier or harder, right? I can, listen to his identity, right? And get identity relevant pants that make it easy for him to wear them, right? I can figure out, maybe there's limitations like, hey, his tiny little fingers don't do really well with snaps because he doesn't have like finger strength yet. And so I shouldn't get pants with snaps. That's an inhibiting pressure, right? And I can start to align interventions against that. That's that behavioral design process. And I'll actually say the least about it because I actually think it's the place where, it's most well understood. Lots of us are used to doing this creative design process. The different piece here is I don't think when people do the creative design process that they often articulate the behavior that they want, right? You have to be going back to that behavioral statement. You can't do good behavioral design in the absence of knowing what it is you want out the other side, right? And 2, I don't think they use good insights, right? They look at these research reports or they read these UX things. I know this is how we, it's so funny actually, Marjolaine, that I never wrote the book as a self-help book. Like that's not how I think of it. I think of it as just like an applied business book. But there are people who read it that way. There was a young woman who's a landscape designer, and she basically just did this on her own behavior all the time. She used to send me pictures. She used to tweet at me pictures of behavioral statements for each week. She'd be like, I'm trying to get myself to do this. Just write a behavioral statement. When I blank, when I want to blank, and all these things. Like, there's that piece. Yeah, Emil, I think, BJ's model is an interesting one. The difference I hear, I think, between BJ's model and things is I think when we talk about ability, motivation, and trigger, we're talking about the pathway along which behavior occurs. But I think it's entirely possible to do BJ's process and not actually get anywhere because you haven't articulated a good behavioral statement and you don't actually have any idea why people are doing this. And, I think that it's reasonable to look at academics and read their models and try and understand, okay, well, this is how behavior works. What we're trying to talk about today specifically is how do we change behavior, right? How do we make sure this happens inside of an organization? And how do we align people against it, et cetera? And so in this behavioral design piece, we have to take this behavioral statement that tells us where we want to go. We have to look at these pressures, and then we have to somehow modify these pressures, right? We're doing this design, and this is where we're going to then go intervention testing, what we call impact evaluation. So, let's say let's stick with the example that we're using, right? We want people to go to really good doctors that they feel really good about. Well, there are promoting pressure. I already talked about one. If you don't believe that, if you don't believe that there is such thing as a, not racist doctor, you're not going to switch, right? So there's an inhibiting pressure. So I need to somehow target things against that. And I can do one intervention, but I can also target lots of interventions. I could send out a flyer that talks about medical racism. I could get another member that goes to that doctor to tell you how good that doctor is. I could make little video intros of all the doctors, right? So that you could see them and you could hear them and you can get them to articulate like how good they are. I could start to align interventions around this sort of pressure and try and use those interventions to modify this pressure. But then we need to evaluate those. That's that 4-stage impact evaluation, right? It's all well and good. This is probably the number one mistake that people make, besides not understanding what behavior they want, is assuming that they want to, because the problem is you've now done a bunch of research. So you're like, I know how this works, right? I am so confident, especially if you're a white dude, right? Like we all know, old white men, right? Like this is a hard phenomena. Like I've done all this research. I totally understand this space now. I don't need to test my interventions because I know stuff, right? Like I've done this research. I know stuff. Why would I waste my time doing impact evaluation? But it turns out just because you think you know something doesn't make it true, right? So you have to go test these things. Hey, I'm going to take 10 members and I'm going to introduce them to another member and have them onboard them into a doctor. And then I'm going to measure, do those people switch doctors? And do they rate those doctors as easy to use, right? I'm going to send out a letter to 20, 30 people, right? That explains, here's a really good doctor near you. Right? Explicitly calls out, hey, I understand medical racism is a thing. Like, I know you're unhappy with your doctor. Here are some really good doctors. Like, let me introduce you to a really good doctor. And I try a bunch of different things. And then I just evaluate those. Again, this doesn't have to be a long process. We do it for 4 weeks, right? It's not crazy long. If this is taking 6 months, 12 months, that's too long. Because remember, we're trying to crank a cycle of innovation here. We're trying to change behavior. And so if you're waiting 12 months, no one's going to let you run that experiment because the business is going to say, well, our business has moved on. We'd rather just bet on something that we don't know if it works, but we have to do something in the intervening 12 months. We can't just sit here twiddling our thumbs, right? So it have to be short experiments, right? That really, test the interventions that you want. So if we go back to my son, right? If I want my son to wear particular kinds of pants, right? I need to try different things. Okay, I'm going to try pants with no strap. I'm going to try pants that are in his favorite color. Maybe I know identity matters. My kid's really into cowboys right now. Maybe if I get cowboy looking pants, he'll wear the, I can tap that promoting pressure, right? I just need to try all those. Before I change all of his pants over to cowboy pants, I'm going to try buying a pair of cowboy pants. I'm going to borrow, Julia and I are friends and I know her kid is roughly the same age as my kid. And so I'm going to borrow pants from her, like just temporary, small experiments, right? Before I commit to the big thing, buying a pair of pants, right? I'm going to get the right one. Now, remember, this is not academic behavioral science. Our level of truth is tuned to the cost-benefit ratio. This is applied behavioral science. So if pants were free, like I don't really care how well this works. I don't need a lot of evidence that tells me that it works because pants are free, but they're not free, right? It costs time and money to go seek out cowboy looking pants. And so I want to know that it works ahead of time. And so, if you're doing this inside of an organization, this often requires some mindset shift, especially if you hire academics. A great example of this is impact evaluation using significance. You're not going to see P less than 0.05. For those of you who are not familiar, quick statistical lesson. So P, significance, tells us how confident can we be that the thing that we observe is true? So let's say, we go get cowboy pants and, we observe how often my son Bear wears them. And it looks like there is an association between, hey, cowboy pants causes him to wear pants, to pick out his own pants more often, right? The way the number works, the smaller it is, the more confident we are, because what we're actually saying when we say it is how probable is it that the thing is not real? It's not due to the thing. It's an illusory correlation. So when we say P equals 0.05, what we are saying is 5%, there is a 5% chance that what we're observing is due to random chance, right? Or something else, right? And a 95% chance that like the two things that I think are associated are actually associated. This is, by the way, highly overly simplistic. Some data scientist somewhere is like puking his guts out while I do this. She's very mad at me right now when I say this. Like, this is highly simplistic, but it works. So in academia, that's the cutoff. We want things to be less than 0.05. We want to be 95 or more % confident that the observed relationship is real. That doesn't have to be true in business, right? Let me give you an example. So again, we're at Clover Health. I used to use this to test my statisticians all the time to keep them in the right frame of mind. I said, I have an intervention, it's P.2. Now, as a refresher, remember that means there's a 1 in 5 chance that it doesn't actually result in the thing that I want. But there's an 80% chance that it does. Again, in academia, they would look at 0.2 and tell me I was wasting my time, right? That is not nearly true enough for us to do something. But remember, we're not academics. We care about applied behavioral science. So the right answer to, Louise, I'm so sorry that you're frozen. She's back. Okay, Louise, welcome back. So the right answer to something's P.2 is, well, what is it we're talking about? So let me tell you about my P.2 intervention. It's a tiny pill. It melts on your tongue, so it's easy to swallow. It tastes of rainbows and unicorn farts, right? Like, it has no known side effects. It costs a penny to produce, and it cures all forms of cancer immediately, and also makes you regrow your hair. Think maybe we should do something with that if it's 80% likely that everything I just said is true? Probably. Probably we should keep going. Probably we should investigate that, right? You have to be doing a cost-benefit ratio. You have to be understanding, right? Like, yes, there is some likelihood. There's always some likelihood that it's not going to work. And remember, everything we do is probabilistic, right? It's not going to work on every kid. Cowboy pants are not going to work for every kid. What we care about is across our entire population. If we have 100 kids, does this work for at least some of them in a non-chance way? And is it cheap enough that makes sense, that impact is big? And so getting people to understand and speak this language inside an organization is really key to doing organizational behavioral science, right? If you're doing behavioral science in an organized way in an organization, people have to have some basic fluidity in some of these concepts, quantitative and qualitative. I talked about the quantitative measurement, but we also want to call people, right? So when I'm sending out letters that say to people, hey, I understand medical racism is a thing. Let me introduce you to these doctors. I don't just want to know, do they go to a new doctor when I look at the data, right? I want to know, how do they feel about that, right? How do they feel about that process? Do they consider, do they think that's something they're going to do over a long time? Because you could get people to do something and they can hate you for it, right? And that doesn't accomplish your macro behavioral goals, right? Because that degrades the brand overall. It's very, very important that qualitative, user research is also involved in this impact evaluation. It isn't just, did the behavior happen? It's, what did that behavior mean to people? How did they feel about it? All right, so quick review. We're in this 4 place. Behavioral strategy, right? Behavioral insights or research, behavioral design, and then behavioral impact evaluation. And the key is the word behavioral in each of those, right? Because you can go shopping in the market. You can get an agency to do these things, but they have to do it from a behavioral lens. It's not enough to do impact evaluation. People will come back and do impact evaluation and they'll tell you something works. But if you don't explicitly define for them a behavioral outcome, what works means won't be cogent for you. It won't actually matter, right? Same thing on design. You can get people to go design a thing, right? And they'll tell you that it's great, but if it's not centered around the behavior that you want to change, that's not behavioral science. Behavioral science is that full loop of those 4 stages that allow us to say, hey, we've articulated what works means, and we found some things that are pretty highly likely to work, right? We've articulated the ruler which we're going to measure them against, and we've measured them against that ruler and said, yeah, these are good enough for us to continue in that process with. And so the nice thing is, nothing I've said today is stuff that you couldn't, it's, what was this, an hour-long presentation? Like, you can get people inside of your organization to understand these things, right? You need to break it down into cogent steps they can understand, feel ownership and mastery over, that can bring together people in the organization, that can center these kinds of things. So I'm going to pause there because I know I've been talking for about an hour. And I want to sort of get to your questions. I answered a few as we went through. But this is the sort of process that I'm trying to get people to go through, right? This sort of 4-step, The whole thing is behavioral science. Now, look, there's nothing wrong with only doing one part of this. If you run an agency, great. Say, hey, I do behavioral research. I do this phase. And I work with people before and I work with people after and I make handoffs in between. There's no shame in that, right? I'm not one of these people who feels, tremendously angry that we have to fight about who can call themselves a behavioral scientist, right? All of us are capable of doing the thing I just said, and it could be in our own lives, changing our son's pant wearing behavior, right? Like there are chances to experiment with this all the time, everywhere. So 4 phases again, we've got behavioral strategy. And the key outcome here is going to be a behavioral statement, right? I'm going to just put the sort of key deliverables as I see them, right? So on the second thing, you have behavioral research or behavioral insights, right? You're going to get that sort of like, you should get some key insights on why would I want that and why am I not already doing it, right? The third phase was the behavioral design. That's going to give you some potential, right? Potential interventions that are based on those insights. And the reason I say potential interventions is, remember, we haven't tested them yet, right? We think they might work based on previous research, but we've not evaluated them. So they're still only potential interventions. And so then we do behavioral impact evaluation, right? Where we get to validated interventions, right? And validated interventions aren't, hey, this will 100% work. It's, yeah, given the cost benefit ratio, we think this might work, right? We have reasonable confidence at a level of cost that we're okay with this. What are the promoting and inhibiting forces at work to get organizations to embrace this behavioral approach or install behavioral science team? Oh, Tom, great question. Basically, Tom's saying you can, and he's making a fantastic point, which is even getting people to embrace this is its own, there is a behavior that is embracing this process, right? And so what are the promoting and inhibiting pressures to embracing this process? So there's a couple things. First of all, you may already have user research, data science, you may already have some of these pieces internally. So part of it is helping them see, hey, we're not taking over what you're doing. We're organizing what you're doing into a process that works better, right? That can be really hard. If you have a bunch of designers, they'll be like, we want to be creative. Like, we got into this for the creative process. I don't want to do sciencey things, right? Even the name behavioral science can be its own inhibiting pressure. That's fine, right? If calling it not science gets you to do it, don't call it science. Call it whatever the fuck you want. It doesn't matter. Because what I care about is the behavior. I'm not wedded to everybody calling. The behavior I want is not everyone calling this science. The behavior I want is people going through these 4 phases, right? So if calling it science doesn't work at your organization, don't call it science. Call it whatever the hell you want. Call it a management restructure. We have to be very, very flexible about how we sort of address those pieces. What should have been the behavioral statement for Yammer? This is a great question, Tom. I don't know, because that's not my job. That is the job of the business leaders of Yammer, right? It is the people, as executives at Yammer, this is the interesting thing about behavioral science. It's not my job to set the behavioral strategy. It is my job to help you articulate the outcome that you want. I don't know what outcome you want. That's not any of my business, right? So if Tom is running a company and I come in, from Frog to help him, it's not my job to tell Tom what he should be doing, right? It's Tom's job to understand his own business and then me to help him articulate that as a behavioral statement that we can then go accomplish. So, I wasn't, involved enough with the Yammer executives to know whether engagement or business value was actually the thing that mattered. They just needed to figure out which one it was. What is the difference between behavioral design and doing lean UX? Problem is, I don't know what lean UX means. Could be lots of things, right? I think how you go through that design process, I think there are lots of ways to do it, to run a design process that I'm fine with. The thing that I care about is, one, that it honors the behavioral statement, right? That you've clearly articulated the outcome that you want in a behavior. Two, that you're designing based on insights about why that behavior doesn't already exist and why anyone would want it to exist. So are you designing to a behavioral statement? Are you designing based on pressures? And then are you centering design on what you're doing? And then are you testing it, right? Evaluating the impact, right? How you actually run your design process, I don't actually care. As long as you're incorporating the fact that you're going to evaluate it after, that you understand that you're designing for a particular behavioral outcome and that you're basing that on particular insights, I don't give a shit how you run your design process. That's fine. I feel confident I want to do the first two steps. I have an idea, and then doing research feels like a step back from doing it. Yeah. Sam asked a great question, which is like basically how do you get people to invest in research because they think they already know what they want to do, right? And they think they already know what they want to do there. And so, Sam, the thing I do is, to me, it's about accountability. So if someone comes to me and they say, remember, I said we could break this up, right? It's okay if not everybody does, if it's not the same person doing all four stages, right? So if the first person, if they come to you and they say, we did the first two stages, we know what behavior we want, and we figured out like why we don't already have it and why anyone would want it, you say, okay, I'm going to design based on the research insights that you've given me. But that means you're taking accountability for them. So if I design something based on the insight that you gave me and it doesn't work, that's your fault, not my fault. Because if the insight was wrong, that you are holding accountability for that, right? If you want me to hold accountability for that, if you're saying, hey, Matt, it's your job to design things that work, great. Then you need to invest in what works means, right? Because you're asking me to be accountable for it. Remember what I said, accountability and autonomy goes hand in hand, right? And so as long as you're fine with it not working based on your faulty research insights, fine, right? And so that's a fine piece. You speak to your partner about eating MMs. Now availability is not a promoting it. Yeah, availability is an inhibiting pressure. We disagree on the question whether the lack of ability or the mere threat of scarcity is promoting pressure. Yes, absolutely. Yes, scarcity can absolutely be a promoting pressure, right? Just ask my son. He doesn't want his food until I threaten to take it away, and then suddenly he wants his food, right? Because the mere absence of something can make it more desirable. This is one of those great behavioral science things, right? That scarcity can make something appear more valuable. Now, generally speaking, it isn't that scarcity itself is what does it. It's scarcity drives something else, right? So, for example, scarcity can drive perceptions of quality. Limited edition, right, drives perceptions of quality. There's only 5,000 of these, suggests, right, that this might be good. That's right. It isn't that the queue is a promoting pressure. Jonathan's example is great, right? Queues outside of a nightclub. Lines out for Americans, lines outside of a nightclub. A long line is not attractive. It's not like the line itself is attractive. It's that the line is a signal of quality, right? Price is a great example. Price can be a promoting pressure, right? When it's a signal of quality. It's an inhibiting pressure when it bankrupts me, right? The money coming out of my pocket, right, is a problem. But when it makes me think that something is more luxurious, right, higher quality, whatever, it can be a signal of things. So there's price as a pressure, but there's also price as sort of an intervention. I can raise the price as an intervention to signaling quality, right? Lockdown makes everything more desirable. Maybe. I think that, I give a talk I don't know why the Dutch love behavioral science, but I give a talk in the Netherlands. I've given a couple of talks throughout the pandemic in the Netherlands. And, I think it's hard to know exactly how all of these things happen. I want a beer. See? Ha! I love it. Right? Scarcity absolutely can absolutely, the lack of availability of something. Hey, there's going to be an M&M shortage. Well, everybody's going to go buy M&Ms. Think of toilet paper. Right? This is actually, let's use pandemic-based examples. Nothing about the toilet paper changed. It's not like suddenly toilet paper became softer, right? Or more identity aligned. There's no like additional promoting pressures. It's just the threat that there wouldn't be some. My co-parent got me for Christmas, you don't appreciate things until they're gone, like toilet paper, right? She got a little sign that said that, right? It's exactly that. You can make the absence of something drop a promoting pressure because it can drive feelings of like, wow, that was actually pretty cool, right? Time does this all the time. We think about it in nostalgia, right? Think about all the things that you didn't really give a shit about as kids, but now they don't exist anymore. And you're like, man, Pop Rocks. I wish there were more Pop Rocks. I'm dating myself here. All right. I think, are we out of time, Julia? Nod. How am I doing? Can I take a couple more questions or no? She's bobbing. Okay.
Yes.
Would you recommend a department for BD and a corporation? Oh.
Yes. We'll do it for 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. Would you recommend a department? Do you mean behavioral design or do you mean business development? What do you mean BD? Behavioral design. See, I can go either way on this, right? Remember what I said. This is the key, Matt Wallaert. That's why I'm going to answer all questions from now on. I care about people doing the process. In some organizations, having a centralized function makes them more likely to do it. In some organizations, decentralizing makes them more likely to do it. Ultimately, what I care about is the organization as a whole doing it, right? That's the outcome that I want. And so I will pivot around, right, to find the right thing. I've gone back and forth with them this, like for a while, I was very hot on the fact that there should be CBOs, right? There should be somebody minding this process. What I will tell you from what happened at Clover is, for a variety of factors that, I have learned from, it became a place where people parked behavioral science intervention, right? So Julia got handed some behavioral science, some behavioral outcome, which all of us are managing behavioral things all the time, right? So Julia's job is to get people to get flu shots. And instead of going through the process herself and using me as like a resource and my team as a resource, she's just like, Matt will figure that out, right? Those behavioral design people over there will figure that out. No. Unless you, like, what ends up happening in that case is you end up running huge parts of the business. By the end of the time I left Clover, I was running customer service, running a big part of clinical ops, right? Like, I just end up running the business because, Julia gets handed a remit that says, get people flu shots. And she says, Matt will do it. So then Matt starts doing it. And then that means it's not Julia's job anymore. It's Matt's job. And now I own Julia's department, right? And centralization has its foibles. I think in really big organizations where it's obvious that behavioral science is not going to solve all the problems for you, it's a little easier to have a centralized team. I think in smaller organizations, the behavioral science department just ends up owning too many, it just ends up being its own functional department. So basically the laws of persuasion applies promoting pressures, right? Yes. So when we say we would persuade people, we are doing one of two things, right? We're either increasing promoting pressure or removing inhibiting pressure, right? And generally what we say persuasion is we are manipulating the salience of some message, right? And so, I avoid the terminology of persuasion because I don't think, if I make M&Ms more available, I didn't persuade you to eat M&Ms, right? I just made them more available. I don't think that falls under the term persuasion, or at least I wouldn't use it that way. So there's actually mostly other manufacturers not being able to switch from industrial. I'm leaving. We're not going to talk about toilet paper. If you want to rewrite your book, what would you spend more time on? Ooh, Fleming. No one's asked me that question. That's a fantastic fucking question. If I was going to rewrite the book, what would I spend more time on? I think I would include a chapter on how to embed this in the organization, right? The stuff we talked about today. So like the book does not articulate these 4 stages. The book is very much like assumes that you are going to be running this process and walks you through the details of the 10-week process that I used, right? It's very, very, very crisp on this very particular, process that we're trying to get you to do. It's not high level enough in some ways. And so if I was going to rewrite a follow-up, in some ways, we might need a higher level thing. Although honestly, there might just need to be a blog post for that. And I'm working on one right now so that we could just, I don't know that you need a whole book for that. But I would definitely stick a chapter in there. What's your most memorable behavioral intervention, something you're proud of? Okay, I got a good one. I am not someone who experiences a bunch of, that's not generally how I look at my career. I'm not like proud of a bunch of behavioral interventions. I'm more proud of the fact that I've gotten people to do behavioral science than I am of any individual intervention. But there's one that I love. So at Clover, one of the problems of medication adherence, getting people to take their meds, is they can't always afford them, right? Cost is a giant inhibiting pressure. So there are, in the US, state programs that will help you afford your medication. And so we were looking at all the data, and we did a bunch of, now we didn't administer the program, but there are things that we could do that make it more likely. So for example, if Julia called in and said, I can't afford my meds, I'll send her the form, right? So that she can fill out that will get her help, right? I can reduce the inhibiting pressure to her finding it herself by sending her the form. So we started going down this path of like, well, I'll help you fill out the form over the phone. So I can't submit it on your behalf, but I can send you an already filled out form and an addressed envelope. All you have to do is sign the thing, stick it in the envelope, and send it out. right? Like I can start to reduce these inhibited pressures, reduce these inhibited pressures. So I was looking at the data, and it turned out that there was one factor about why people weren't getting this help from the government on how to pay for their medication, and it was language. And what turned out was the form only existed in English, and you had to fill it out in English. And in New Jersey, the state where I was doing this, about 15% of adult state people did not speak English fluently. And so this was this massive problem. And so after about a year of lobbying, actually got the state government to reissue the form and accept the form in Spanish. And so we could dramatically improve the lives of a lot of people by removing one key inhibiting pressure, which was language. I really love that one, right? Because it's one of those things that, like, you know, you just need to go through the process to sort of figure out what the thing was and then beat the hell out of some politicians until it works, right? And so I am pretty proud of that one. You know, I am I was telling somebody about this the other day. You know, people have a different default approaches to the world. I'm a little like the Hulk. I'm just kind of always angry. And so, you know, particularly things that are sort of, that feel unfair to me. I have a high sense of procedural justice. And so that really pissed me off when I figured out that, like, bunch of people who were already poor, already struggling, were made to struggle more and continue to be poor and not get their medication and fucking die because some asshole didn't translate a form. Fuck you, dude. Like, just fuck you. I will go fight you. And so it took a year. It was very hard. Like, and it's not easy to get the government to change things, but finally, I think I said, if you don't do this, I will go tell the press that you didn't do it. Right? Like, if I go tell a newspaper that you, like, it has been brought to your attention that lots of people can't use this program because you didn't do it in Spanish. Exactly. Public pressure. Did you come across clients who have not yet defined concrete? Right? Oh, yeah. For sure. There are companies that have been in business for 100 years that don't know what the fuck behavior they're trying to create. They've never articulated that before. They've never thought through that lens. That's why I said, you know, it's weird. It's one of the things that is hardest to get in the market, right? You can go to fucking BCG or whoever, and they won't give you this. Like, there are very few behavioral strategy places in the market. If we break this up, lots of behavioral design, some behavioral research. The two places that are hardest to get in the market are the behavioral strategy and the behavioral impact evaluation. It's hard to get somebody to measure your shit, and it's hard to get somebody to force you to articulate a behavioral outcome. Lots of us do it passively, right? If you're running a behavioral design agency, you're probably getting people to articulate some version because you can't do your job until they do. But it's shocking to me how many companies have no idea what behavior they're trying to create in people. So yeah, Vincent, just all the time. I mean, it's rampant. And in some ways, the older the company, the less likely they are to know, right? People have read, you know, startups have read my book. They know they're supposed to be creating around some behavioral outcomes. But if you're a 200-year-old company and you're big, right? This is the innovation dilemma that always happens, right? If you're MasterCard and you've been around for 100 fucking years and you make $1 gajillion a year doing exactly the same thing you've always done, when I come to you and say, hey, you really need to understand what behavior you're trying to create, you're like, fuck you, man. I make $1 trillion a year. Like, why do I care? Right? It's those big, old money-making. Nobody wants to do this until they're in danger. And the companies that are really good are the ones who recognize that they need to do it without being in danger. All right, last question is Jonathan. I feel like the advert needs to be part of being here. Yeah, 100%. Right? Like, the intervention is like, it goes back to this pen, right? I only care about the intervention to the extent that it drives the behavior, right? And that's the hard part. People fall in love with their fucking ideas. They fall in love with interventions. This is a prideless work. You have to be like, you know what? Didn't work. Thought it would work. Thought that, you know, making jalapeno flavored M&Ms would be a good idea. Didn't work. Move on, right? You have to be willing to sort of like not get too wedded to something, because unfortunately the way the human brains are created, we have this confirmation bias, right? And so once we believe something will work, we will bend over backwards to try and think of it as something that will work, right? So yeah. All right, folks, we got to be done here. It's super
Matt,
fun. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Matt, for your amazing talk. You certainly helped us forget that it is 3 a.m. in the morning in San Diego. What an amount of energy you bring when you explain your views and insights with us. It was truly a pleasure hearing you speak. And I remember that being specific about the relevant behavior makes a difference, having cross-validation, and that we don't change behavior but change the process. But I can see about the many reactions in the chat that you've inspired many of our several hundred people that have been following your talk with much enthusiasm. It was an amazing kickoff for us of our Virtual Design Fest week. We are happy to invite all of you again tomorrow for, again, an inspirational session with Tim Versnel about behavior design for sustainability. And it was a pleasure to have you here. So welcome you all and see you tomorrow. Thank you, Matt, again, for an amazing talk.
Thanks for having me. Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks everybody for spending some time. I know it's I know you all have things to do in your day, and I appreciate your time and attention. I'm really easy to get a hold of if you have follow-up or questions we didn't get answers to. And please spend some time, follow the Sue folks, and enjoy the rest of the week with all the great speakers that you're going to get.
Thanks. Bye-bye. See you tomorrow all.